Welcome to everyone. Today, topic is entitled An Introduction to Vedic Cosmology. And Vedic cosmology is a very vast subject, and it's covered in several Puranas, and it's very difficult to cover all of that today. So I will just try to give some basic introductory ideas, and this introduction will cover, just one idea, which is what is the nature of space, or how Vedic philosophy views space very differently from how modern science views space, or how we, most of us at the present, view space. Like if you think of space, then you will think of things that are in front of you, and you measure the distance in terms of how far they seem or appear to be from you. But space has a very different meaning in Vedic philosophy. So we'll talk about that nature of space, and compare that nature of space to some of the problems in modern science, because cosmology today is essentially a derivative of the theory of general relativity. And general relativity is a theory that's derived from special relativity, which was, the byproduct of the reconciliation of classical mechanics and electrodynamics. And classical mechanics is essentially Newton's gravitation theory. So all these theories essentially form a continuum, and they try to study the nature of mass, and the study of cosmology is nothing but the study of the nature of mass. And of course, we have to be able to see that mass in terms of galaxies and planets and things like that. So nature of light and the nature of mass are integrated in the study of relativity. So with those brief remarks, if there is any specific topic that you would like me to cover, then I can do that. Otherwise, I'll launch straight away into my presentation. Let me put that in the slideshow mode. So, as I said briefly, Vedic cosmology uses a different concept of space. And that different concept is that space is like an inverted tree rather than a box. So what is an inverted tree? It has root upwards, and from that root emanate, trunks. And then from the trunks emanate branches. From the branches emanate twigs and leaves. And space is described as this inverted tree. And it's in modern science, we think of it of space as a box, right? Box might be slightly curved and so on, but basically it's a box. And the 3 dimensions of the box are supposed to be the 3 dimensions of space, whereas this inverted tree is infinite dimensional. But these infinite dimensions are constructed out of 3 modes of nature, which constitute what we call 3 dimensions. So we'll discuss some of that, and also we'll try to draw some comparison to the nature of space in modern physics, specifically relativistic theories. There are also things that there's not going to be enough time to cover, which is topics like dark energy and dark matter, and cyclical understanding of time. So this is just a very simple introduction to the concept of space. Once we understand the nature of space, then we can talk about the universe. So the most fundamental difference in modern science and Vedic cosmology is that space is not a domain of objects, right? So in modern science, if you people talk about space, we can think of Newtonian or Euclidean space in which there are some objects, and these objects are physical. And beginning with Descartes' mind-body dualism, all these objects have a single property, which is called extension. Because of extension, they can have other properties like shape and size and things like that. But Descartes defined space as res extensa. So the fundamental property is extension, and that extension is defined in terms of geometry and physical property, which is length. But space in Vedic philosophy is the domain for every kind of conscious experience. That means if you're having a thought, that's also in space. If you have a feeling, that's also in space. If you have a goal and intention, that's also in space. If you have a sensation, that's also in space. So what we mean by space is much broader in the sense that it has many more properties than the property of extension. Specifically, there are many kinds of meanings, which include intentions, conceptual meanings, and so on. So last time we briefly talked about Sankhya philosophy, and in this philosophy there are multiple types of entities. You can call them objects, but they're not really objects in the physics sense. But there are different categories or entities. So these entities are sense objects, sense properties, senses, thoughts, beliefs, intentions, and morals. And we didn't have time in the last lecture to discuss what these 7 things are, but I'll just give some brief examples. So sense objects, essentially what we mean by that is properties like red, yellow, green, bitter, sweet, hard, tough, all these things. And these properties are, and so these are, you can say, the values of some properties. And the properties themselves are color, shape, taste, smell, sound, so on. And then there are senses like seeing, tasting, touching, smelling, hearing. Okay? So in the case of seeing, for example, you can see 5 things. One is you see shape, you see color, you see size, you see distance, direction. So like that, each sense allows for 5 kinds of property perception. And each property perception itself allows for many kinds of values of those properties. So that's why there is a difference between the objects, which are values, that there are properties, and senses. So you can think in terms of physics, where you say mass is a property, right? So this is called tanmatra, but in English it's called property. And you have a value for that property, and that property itself is measured by a measuring instrument. You can say weighing scale. So senses are like that weighing scale. Then there's a property called mass, and there is a value of thing. But once you get all these, once you employ all the senses and you get different properties, then you have object concepts, which are called thoughts, or you can call that meanings. English is a very difficult language to explain some of this. So bear with me if the words don't match exactly what I'm trying to explain, because there is no equivalent word sometimes. So, so by thoughts, I mean object concepts like table and chair. So a table has properties like it has some shape, it has some size, it has a weight, hardness, color, and so on. So each object divides into many senses, right? So you can touch the table, you can see the table, and so on. So if you had food, you can even smell the food, taste the food, things like that. So above these or beyond these is these thoughts are beliefs. Based on these beliefs, we understand the nature of the world. And what I mean by belief is, like I've given examples of belief in modern world. For example, people say the world is uniform. That's a belief. Or you can say space is uniform. That's a belief. Or you can say life has no purpose. Everybody is equal. So these are all beliefs by which our thinking is conditioned. Similarly, if you change, and more in science, essentially what you call a theory is the embodiment of certain beliefs. Like classical mechanics is the simple embodiment of this idea that the world is uniform, a space is uniform, time is uniform, and space is isotropic. And so based on these beliefs, you get the notion of a space. That space itself defines all the conservation properties of matter. So, and then above that is what we call intentions. And we want to be rich and powerful and knowledgeable and beautiful and so on. And the highest level in terms of experienced matter is something it's called Mahat, the ideas of greatness, or you can also call ideals in this world. So ideals are justice, honesty, kindness, self-control, tolerance, and so on. So these are the 7 levels. So when we say we are talking about space, we're talking about something in which all these things exist, right? So the idea of justice and honesty or tolerance is also in space. It also has a location in space. And when I have, certain moral value or an ideal, then I am experiencing that thing in space. Similarly, if I want to become a rich person, that intention is also in space. Okay. If I say the world is uniform, even though it may be a false idea, it still exists in space. Like if I say sky is purple, that thought also exists in space. And it has a location. It may be a false idea, but it has an existence in space. Similarly, all kinds of object concepts like elephants and tigers and tables and chairs. So all these properties, they have an existence in space. So what we mean by space is something that embodies everything. It's not just res extensa. It is not just triangles and squares and rectangles and particles and everything else that's constructed from geometry. Right? We cannot reduce table or tasting and seeing to geometry, or we cannot reduce kindness and tolerance to geometry. So this space is different. But because we're talking about space, we should be able to talk about some geometry, right? Even though it doesn't reduce to Euclidean geometry, there has to be a geometry, otherwise, there cannot be a space. So this essentially understanding of space, when it includes a wide variety of experiences, boils down to identifying what is that alternative geometry, or what is that geometry in terms of which we can accommodate all this variety. Now, couple of things before we get into the nature of the space. One thing that we have to understand is that even though we have these 5 sensations of tasting, touching, smelling, seeing, and hearing, all these sensations, they appear in the mind as well, right? And similarly, the ideas about the mind appear in the sensations as well. Right? So you can, in very simple terms, you can say the ideas about the external world apply to the mind, and the ideas about the mind apply to the external world. And these 2 kinds of applications make it very hard to make mind-body distinctions, right? Which is the foundation of Cartesian philosophy, and it is essentially the foundation of all of modern science. So I'll give you an example. Like this slide actually talks about a lot of metaphors, right? Which are all sensation metaphors, but they're applied to the nature of the mind. So you can say there are high and low morals, where height is essentially a visual concept, or something that you see is high and low. You can apply that to morality. You can say future is ahead and past is behind, right? So when you talk about ahead, that's basically in the direction in which you are looking. And that's again a sight concept. And past is behind, that's something that's behind you. You can say talk about dark thoughts and hard judgments, or judgment is clouded. Somebody is stone-hearted. Now, stone-hearted essentially means he has a hard heart. And what that means is somebody is intolerant, or somebody is not perceptive, or somebody doesn't have feelings, and so on. So the idea of hardness, which is a touch sensation, is applied to emotions. Similarly, you can talk about hard subject, or you can talk about a cool guy, or somebody is looking hot, things like that. So there are, you know, essentially millions and millions of these metaphors. I've just tried to list some of them here. And literature is essentially all these metaphors, right? So if you write a non-fiction subject, or if you write non-literary subject or a technical subject, then you just rely on the five sensations. But if you're writing literature, you can say that the person, in a simple text, you'll say person was walking in the night. But in a poetic or in a literary sense, you'll say the night fell and the darkness engulfed him, right? So that use of metaphor is also a mental experience, and poetry and literature try to capture that metaphorical experience, because it's a mental experience. So what literature essentially is doing is trying to externalize the mind and explain the experience of the mind in terms of words. Similarly, mental metaphors also apply to the body, right? And this is a deeper subject. There's not enough time, but I'll just try to explain. Like, for example, if you have an immune system, then immune system, we talk about uh, body has the capacity to recognize a virus, right? Right now, we talk a lot about this stuff. So there is a capacity to recognize these viruses, or if you have eaten food, enzymes are secreted after eating food, right? Because there is something in the stomach that recognizes there is some food. If you simply drink water, or you drink different kind of liquids, certain enzymes are not secreted. So they have the capacity to recognize what is being consumed, what kind of enzyme is required to digest it, and so on. So that cognitive capacity in your stomach is just like the mental capacity to cognize things. Similarly, it's not just that the mind has some habits, or person has some habits. Even the body has habits, like adaptation to cold or heat is a habit. So certain people are naturally inclined, or accustomed to certain kind of. Some people like to drink a lot of water because they always feel thirsty. Right? That's a habituation. So in this way, the mental metaphors apply to the mind, and the bodily metaphors apply uh, to uh, to the mind, and the mental metaphors apply to the body. So we cannot create this mind-body separation the way it is conceived of. So if you're studying matter purely in terms of geometry, it's not just that you cannot study the mind. That's only part of the problem. The bigger part of the problem is you also will not be able to explain how a body gets habits, how the body has the capacity to recognize things, just like the mind has the capacity to, how body has a memory. So there are many properties of matter which we cannot explain if we do not invoke the mind. Similarly, of course, we cannot explain the mind, if we do not invoke the properties of the body, right? So this is a continuum. Mind and body are not two separate things, and yet we use those words, in the sense that there is a hierarchy of concepts, from values to properties to senses to object concepts, and so on. So there is a hierarchy. Therefore, we make a distinction between mind and body, but the concepts of the body apply to the mind, and the concepts of the mind apply to the body. So one simple way to explain this hierarchy is to think of these five levels: sensation, thought, judgment, intentions, and morals. And as I just explained that, you can talk about, high morals, low morals, tough intentions, or a tough person, or tough judgment, dark thoughts, and things like that. So you can apply all the metaphors of sound, touch, sight, taste, and smell to your mental experience. And this is called metaphorical experience, but it is real experience. It may be developed in some people, it may not be so developed in other people, but essentially poetry and literature bring out this experience. Even music brings out this experience, right? So similarly, the sensation stuff is called literal experience, but of course modern science rejects it, doesn't recognize there's anything called touch, taste, smell, sign. These are all supposed to be epiphenomena or hallucination sort of created from molecules. How that thing is created is something nobody knows. So there's a famous thing that's called the hard problem of consciousness, and that's all about, they're just talking about sensation, right? So this itself, they are finding it impossible to explain in terms of physics. Forget about all the other stuff, the hierarchy. So this is two dimensions I just explained, but actually uh, we can broaden this idea, and this is simplified representation of Sankhya philosophy, where you have three dimensions, where you have action, knowledge. So these are called sound, touch, sight, taste, smell, are called senses of knowledge, or Gyanendriya. Knowledge is a bad word, but this is the word, Gyanendriya is the term used. Similarly, it's called Karmendriya, hands, legs, speech, and things like that. So these are the two so-called sthula or gross realities. And this is the, you can say this is the lowest level of reality. And on top of this reality are similar levels upon levels upon levels of reality. And in each of these levels, these metaphors or these concepts of hard and soft, tough and gentle and far and near, forward and above and below and things like that, all these concepts, they appear at each level, right? So morals, intentions, judgment, thought, senses, properties. So even though these concepts are described at the lowest level, but they appear in all of these things. And similarly, the properties of having an intention or a purpose appears at the gross level also. So for example, your senses, they have an attraction towards objects. Not everybody is at all, everybody's senses are not attracted to everything, right? Your ears may be attracted to a particular type of sound or a particular kind of music, and not attracted to other kinds of things. Similarly, your tongue may be attracted to a particular kind of taste, or nose may be attracted to a particular kind of smell. So these are not blank slates, so to speak, right? This is not tabula rasa. This is not a blank slate. Every person has got some proclivities, and because of those proclivities, every sense is also attracted to certain kinds of objects and not attracted to certain kinds of things. So this is, anyway, a simple three-dimensional picture is like this, that you have two dimensions of knowledge and action, and these two dimensions are reflected at each level. And similarly, all these levels are also reflected. So this creates an extremely complicated, geometry or, notion of space. That space is described as an inverted tree. And so this is like, if you had, for example, the moral of that everything is equal, then based on that moral you will create some intentions, and based on that you'll have some beliefs, then you have some thoughts, then you have some sensations, sense objects, and so on. So that tree structure is extremely complicated, but I'm just trying to describe what we mean by an inverted tree. And that inverted tree is simply that our experience has many layers, and each layer is dependent on the previous layer. So just like a tree grows from a root and expands into trunks, and so on, similarly, this tree grows. The simple idea here is that the contingent idea or the contingent experience is dependent on a more abstract or more subtle experience. They use the term subtle or sukshma, but it's dependent on. And I gave the example last time that if you wanted to see a cow, you must have the idea of a cow beforehand. If you don't have the idea of a cow, then you cannot perceive a cow. In the same way I explained in the case of numbers, even to count 1, 2, 3, 4, I was explaining how these the set theoretic construction of numbers is done, that construction is always problematic because you assume the existence of the number in order to talk about that number. So for example, if you had to talk about the number 0, you required two brackets, which means you needed the number 2 before you can talk about 0. So so all these, so the basic understanding is that all these concepts, the concept must exist before its example or instantiation or detailing comes later on. Right? So this is the detailing and this is the abstract. So this is also, so each, once you have put these things in a tree structure, then you can count them. You can say 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And therefore, each of these things gets a number. But that number is not a quantity. It's actually a representation of a type or a meaning. So this space essentially gets counting, which is based on numbers, which is why this philosophy is also called Sankhya. And the universe is just like this tree. And there are some more pictures in the subsequent slides where I'll explain how the universe's structure is described. But it is essentially an inverted tree structure in which the Jivatma or the soul moves. Okay, so the tree is fixed. Objects are not moving, but a consciousness is moving from one location to the other. And that movement of consciousness leads to an experience which is then interpreted as motion, even though it is not a motion. Right? So there are many intricacies that arise because of the motion. So what we mean by space itself is fixed. Nothing is moving in space, right? Space is fixed. And what is moving, or you can call the particle that's moving, that particle is the soul. And as it moves to a new location, it acquires or gets a new experience. And that new experience includes experience of your thoughts, sensations, and even objects, or even having the body. So when the soul has moved to a particular place, then the consciousness has come to that place and it acquires a certain kind of experience. Now, one more thing is, if you wanted to measure distance in this space, let's say I wanted to measure from this point to that point, right? So let's say I wanted to discover from the fifth circle here to the last circle here. I cannot jump from here to here. There is no straight line path between this point and this point, because this is the structure of space. So if I have to go from this point to this point, then I have to go up here, then up to the next higher point, then to the next higher point, up to the root, and then I can descend downwards. Right? So distance, or why in modern cosmology you will see people talk about a curved space-time, or distance is not a straight line. That is essentially because the space itself is like a tree. It is not a straight line, because I cannot jump from here to here. There are no 2 points in which I can, except very rarely you can jump from this lower point to this higher point. You can say it's a straight line. But otherwise, most of the time, whenever you're moving, you're always moving on some curved trajectory. And therefore, and I'll not get into the general relativistic terms and try to explain this idea, but basic point is that we are, all the space is curved. It's not that there is a flat space and this curvature is added onto that, which is what modern science does. But essentially, from ground up, the space is always curved. And another point here is, so you can, like in Euclidean geometry, the fifth axiom is that the shortest path is a straight line, and they try to break that. So this is also a kind of non-Euclidean geometry, but it's a completely different structure of or sense in which it's non-Euclidean. So now let's just do a simple contrast based on whatever we have discussed. Modern cosmology is the study of space as a collection of objects, or res extensa, which is things that are which have geometrical properties. Vedic cosmology is also geometrical properties. We are not talking about something additional that exists outside of space and time. Instead, we are redefining the nature of space and time, where uh, every experience is simply space, right? So there is no concept of matter that is different from space, which is, in Euclidean geometry or in classical mechanics, you said there is space and there is some object, matter is different from space. And in the relativistic theories, we say that matter is nothing but curvature of space, right? So it's a property of space. In the same way, all our experiences are simply properties of space, but that space is completely different. Similarly, in modern cosmology, you can talk about empty space, but there's no such thing as empty space. All space is a potentiality for. So if the consciousness moves to that location in space, then experience arises. So it's not an empty space. So, and instead of a box, it's like an inverted tree, and the space comprises of every kind of experience. Now, based on these, high-level concepts about the nature of space, we'll try to understand a little bit about special and general relativity, the notion of absolute space. So, so this space that we talked about previously is an absolute space in the sense that it is fixed, right? It has a fixed origin in the sense that that root is the origin, and the directions are also fixed because the branches are fixed or trunks are fixed. So it's an absolute space, but that creates a problem in cosmology because we have to now talk about what we mean by relative space and things like that, and how science talks a lot about relativity. So these are very fundamental issues. If you are going to understand Vedic cosmology, then we have to understand how it relates to or is different to modern science, because otherwise we will just talk about some words that are there in Puranas and we will not understand, and that will be one world, this will be another world. So we have to change what we mean by motion, and briefly talked about it. There is a motion of the person or the soul, and so this is another way to represent. This is a more accurate representation of what I talked about, the inverted tree structure. And I talked about there are multiple levels. I've just shown 4 levels here, but there are several levels, and each one of them, each level has an immensely complex tree structure, right? So you can also say the inverted tree structure begins in the root here and it expands outward. And I'll not get into too much detail why this particular construction is done, but this is a simplified picture of. So it's a space of all the experiences, and there are many tiers in that. Um, Based on, you can understand, based on the fact that bodily experiences are reflected in the mind and mental properties are reflected in the body. Now, there is another notion of relative space that arises even in this experience, and that relative space arises not because of actual distance, but due to interaction to certain things, right? So you can euphemistically think in terms of, let's say, you are in one city and your wife or husband is in another city, and you can say we are mentally very close, or we are emotionally very close, right? So we use these concepts of distance, or somebody may be sitting next to you, but you can say he is totally zoomed out, or he's not there, even though his body is there, mind is not there. So we have these concepts of distance and proximity and distance, which are based on whether you are interacting with something or you are not interacting with something, right? So this notion of distance or proximity, it arises because of an interaction. So if you have a strong interaction, then you can say I'm close. Let's say it's like you can say I'm mentally close to so and so, or I'm mentally far from so and so. So if you have strong interaction, that's proximity. If you have a weak interaction, it gives rise to distance. Similarly, you can say in a telescope, if you see the moon appears nearer and bigger. And that's because you are using the telescope to interact with the moon. And if you look in a microscope, similarly, things look bigger. So there are certain ways of interaction by which things come closer, and certain ways of interaction by which things get further. So this artificial sense of proximity and distance is what we can understand is as relative space. So there are two words that are often used, and we can distinguish between them as change and motion, right? So the motion, the soul moving from one body to the other. These are different states, right? Childhood is a state, boyhood is a state, youth is a state, and old age is a state. So as this soul moves from one state to the other, this is called change of body, or you can say change of experience. Now, in that state, in each state, you can also have some interactions with certain other things, like I've shown table and chair. So sometimes you interact with the chair and you see you have a sense of proximity, and then you don't interact with that object, and that sort of, there's a distance. A good example of this whole problem right now is that you can see me on the Zoom call. So I am in one city and you are in a different city, or maybe multiple cities, and you can still see me face to face, and that's because of an interaction, right? So I seem to be very close to you face to face, even though I am physically millions of miles apart. And that is the general principle by which we understand this relative proximity and distance. If you interact, there is proximity. If you don't interact, proximity is not. So this is called change, and this is called motion, right? So, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So this illusory space, or what we can call relative space, is basically there are, and this is much more. The slide is far more detailed and or diving into detail than I can actually cover. There's a book called Time and Consciousness. If you're interested, that actually discusses this detailed process of how the interaction occurs. But in a very simple sense, and I've taken the example of light here. Light has two properties, just we can call strength and power. And in physics, we only use power. We don't use the concept of strength. But in actual picture, if you study graphics and pictures and things like that, there are two concepts which are called contrast and brightness. So if you want to see, let's say the moon is very big, and if you want to see the moon, then if you want to see the whole moon, then you have to be very far from that. As you go further and further, the light from the moon has to be high intensity. So brightness has to increase. But as the distance is increased, the detailing of the craters on the moon, you cannot see that. So the contrast has to decrease. Okay? So the contrast decreases, the brightness increases, and that is what you call the big picture, right? Or you're seeing the big thing as a whole. Similarly, if you wanted to see the craters on the moon, you zoom into the moon picture, and that requires low brightness. If the brightness is very high, you would not be able to see the craters. So you have to lower the brightness and you have to increase the contrast. So this is a very simple example. More detailed physics is involved in this, but just to illustrate by an example. So if you have a strong if you have strength, and if you have a high strength and low power, then you get the details. If you have a low strength and high power, then you get a big picture, right? So that's essentially what it is. This slide is talking about. So the point is this: without any movement, right? So without any movement, you can simply tamper with the contrast and brightness, and by that you can create an effect of distance, right? This is a basic property of light. You can create a distance. So so something can seem bigger and something can seem smaller, and that gradual increase in size will create the impression that something is moving when actually nothing is moving. So this is what can understand this relative space. And based on that, we can understand what is speed of light. Why is it constant? And it's constant because the individuals in that space are fixed. And therefore, light can travel in any direction as long as it's traveling the same. You will always see the same speed of light because there is actually no motion. Motion is an effect rather than I mean, what you're perceiving as light is basically constant distance, and that's why you get constant speed. But at the same time, even though the distance, there is no actual motion, there is an illusion of motion being created because of strength and power changes. So if the interaction is changing, this person has the illusion of saying that the light is moving, or or has the illusion that he is himself moving. Right? There's a relative motion. So without moving, there can be an illusion of movement just by the change of strength and power of light. But if this person is not moving, then he can have an illusion of I am stationary. Factually, both are stationary. So by this process, you can understand the distance and movement are the byproducts of an interaction with the world, even when there is. So this is important to understand that even in absolute space, there can be a relative construct or relative space construct where you see things that are see things to be moving even when they're actually stationary. This is slightly more detailed. If somebody is interested, there is this concept of redshift and blue shift of light. So if you're moving away from a light source, you'll get a redshift. If you're moving towards light source, there is a blue shift. So redshift increase indicates a decreasing power of interaction, and it creates this impression that something is moving away. So, and I've used this concept of fewer words are exchanged, but there's some more discussion required about nature of quantum reality and nature about atomism, what atoms actually mean. But I'm just summarizing that here, that when we receive individual quanta, they are not just, it is not simply a change in the frequency, but also the change of the meaning of what that information, the quantum represents. That meaning or semantic aspect of the quantum is not studied in present atomic theory, which is why there are numerous problems in atomic theory. But essentially, if you can think of light, if you're moving away from that object, and the thing seems to get and the brightness is increasing, you'll see the bigger picture, but you will see it with less details. Right? So just like if you went further away from the moon, you can see the whole moon, but you won't see the details of the moon. And if you went very close to the moon, you will see the rocks and craters on the moon, but you won't see the full moon. So it's big picture without details, or detailed picture with details. So that's essentially redshift and blue shift of light. The same principle applies when if you like, let's say if this person is moving towards the light bulb, there is a strong interaction, which is why he thinks he's moving towards the light source. Right? Factually, he's not moving, and because of this strong interaction, there is a weak interaction with the other observer. That weak interaction makes this observer say that the observer A is farther and shorter. These are implications. This is much more detailed. People who are savvy in physics can get this point, but basically the properties of length contraction, time dilation, etc., and relativity, they all arise as a side effect of these interactions. So and we can understand these things if we think of a consciousness that's so if you're focused on one thing, then you're not focused on something else. Let's say if you were talking to somebody else, and somebody else talking A talking to B, and C keeps saying keep asking you questions or keep trying to interrupt the conversation, you respond, but you don't respond as quickly because you're engrossed in another conversation, right? So that strong interaction gives the sense of rather that weak interaction, or the other person who's not receiving the responses will think that the messages are coming slowly to me, therefore this person must really be very far, right? So, and if the person is close, then I get a response immediately. But if I'm getting the response less frequently, then that person is naturally far. So that is essentially, so you see that length has, and then, this person, because he's far, this is size is smaller because he's gone farther. So this is a effect of the absolute space conceived, followed by a change in the idea of motion, right? So there is so you get greater distance, lower contrast, higher brightness, faster time, big picture. These are all mutual, effects of each other. I'll not spend a lot of time. If somebody is interested, there's a book called Time and Consciousness which discusses this. Now, why is all this stuff important? It's important to understand that we can describe the cosmos consistent with the relativistic observations, but with a completely different set of assumptions, right? So my assumption, or the assumptions of Vedic cosmology, is that there is an absolute space, and the relative space is created through an interaction. So by the change in the definition of space and the definition of motion, the same effects are described, right? So the observations remain unchanged, but the explanation of that observation is completely different. Now, a quick summary of this. Now you can think of this in terms of Newton's gravity. In Newton's gravity, you say as the two bodies move farther apart, there is an inverse square law which says the force decreases inversely in the inverse square law of distance, right? So force is an effect and distance is the cause. So as the distance increases, the force decreases. In Vedic cosmology, the same idea is there, but it's inverted, where you say that distance is the effect of force. So if you're interacting strongly, then you are close. If you're interacting weakly, then you're far. So in Newton's theory also, you would say if you were far, that would be because of distance. But here we'll say if you're interacting, weakly, then that is appearance of distance. So it's basically force is the effect of distance in Newton's gravity, and in Vedic cosmology, the thinking is inverted. The distance is an effect of force, right? So these things are, I consider them very important, but most of the people who are studying Vedic cosmology today do not dwell on any of this stuff, and they sort of create a parallel description of the cosmos, which is completely contradictory to modern science, and there is no way one can reconcile the other, because there is no physics involvement, there is no equivalence in geometry, there is no understanding of non-Euclidean geometry, there is no discussion of the nature of light, there is no concept of time dilation and length contraction and things like that, and sort of a parallel cosmological reality is created which stands in contrast to everything that physics is doing. And that cannot be a scientific conversation. It can be a theological or a religious conversation, and I don't want to engage in that. So so far, anything that I can take questions on, or should I keep moving?
You can ask somebody if they have any questions.
No, Ashish, I think you can go ahead. Maybe at the end we'll take questions.
Okay, sounds good. So now we will get into even more difficult concepts about the nature of space, which is that this space is semantic in nature and not a physical space, right? So we have talked about one set of properties, which is about hierarchy, which is about the nature of interactions, and you could potentially still think in terms of some physics concepts. Because there is still some force of interaction, there's power and strength, and things like that. But now we'll get into something that's completely counterintuitive, and that requires even more different way of thinking. Now, to understand the nature of space, we have to understand what we mean by consciousness or by the mind. And I just use use these words interchangeably. Doesn't mean they are interchangeable, but for our present discussion, they are sort of interchangeable. So when you look at an apple, right, there is a real apple outside, and there is a mental representation of an apple inside your mind or your consciousness, right? In the same way, there is a real self that is outside your consciousness, and there's a picture of the self which is inside your consciousness, right? So this picture is what is called ahankara. It's in English you can call it ego. So everybody is carrying a picture of who they are, and they're carrying some picture about the nature of the world. And the real self and the real apple are outside. Now the problem arises, this is what you see as apple. And when we talk about the apple in terms of perception, this is what we are talking about. We are not actually talking about what the real apple outside is. And this is a huge conversation in Western philosophy. And, at the beginning of empiricism, this was discussed that, there is a philosopher called, George Berkeley. He says, esse percepi. Essence of everything is to be perceived. And what you are seeing is essentially your perception. You have no clue about what the reality is. And this went on. David Hume, who said you cannot establish causality because all that you're talking about is perception and you don't know what's happening really outside. Right? So these are like well established even in Western philosophy and even in Indian philosophy. But the basic idea is that what you're seeing, what you call an apple, is inside your, it's your mental perception. And the only reason we all agree on what that is because we have a similar way of perceiving. Right? So my mind is similar to your mind. So we can talk about things like red and green and apple and table and things like that. And we have this vocabulary. So because of the similarity, but the similarity is inside us. We are not able to communicate with dogs or other species of life because they have a different way of looking at or perceiving the world. Similarly, we are all carrying a picture of the self. Right? Everybody has some idea about who they are, what is their place in the world, what is the nature of life, what is their ambitions, or are they great or not great, and their sense of ego. All these things are, they constitute the picture of the self. Now I have simplified this picture. There are actually many levels, right? So there is what I call material consciousness, and this ego is actually one simple level. There are multiple levels as we have discussed. Right? So they will create picture inside a picture, inside a picture, inside a picture. So there's like a fractal structure or a self-replicating reality existing inside the reality. But this is a very simple representation where there's a real thing which is outside, and what you see is inside. And this is what we see as the apple and what we see as. So like in this life, if you say, who are you? And we talk about the soul, we are talking about something here. This is something people don't understand. What they understand is this ego, right? What is the picture of the self inside my consciousness? So when very, very easy to talk about this ego, very difficult to talk about the self. In the same way in physics, very easy to talk, or in any empirical observation, very easy to talk about what's inside, very difficult to talk about what's outside, right? So that's a general pattern of. So in this way, there are three things. There is a real self, there is a consciousness, and there's a picture of the self. We'll return to these three things subsequently. So in the same way, we have to now, the revolution in thinking is that, we have given up the idea of reality as physical things. Now we are thinking in terms of semantics, right? We are thinking in terms of concepts. So in the same way, there is something called earthly space, which is different from the earth. And there is the what we call the earth, what science calls the earth and what we call the earth is a picture of the real earth. It is not the real earth, but it is a picture of the real earth. Similarly, what we see as the moon, as craters and things like that, it is not the real moon. It is an earthly representation of the moon. And this whole thing, which is the entire cosmos, like all the galaxies, all the planets, all the stars, everything is basically an earthly vision of some Earth or non-Earth reality, right? So Earth also has a vision, which is a picture inside, and and similarly, there's the moon. I've just only shown the moon here. It's impossible to show all the Jupiter, Mars, and Sun and things beyond that. But there is a earthly vision. Now, what happens is everybody is in physics, they are converting this vision of reality itself into reality, right? But in Vedic cosmology, what they're talking about, they just do not care about this earthly vision, right? What you are seeing is completely irrelevant. And they are interested in talking about the real earth and the real moon. So a big discrepancy arises that everybody in modern cosmology will talk about what we are seeing, how far this is based on the light, and and things like that. Whereas in Vedic cosmology, they are talking about the real stuff that's outside. And if we do not make this distinction, then we think that this thing that is outside is actually the thing that is inside. So, for example, if Vedic cosmology will say the Bhuloka is flat, then people start doing this flat Earth thing here, which is completely false because they don't distinguish between what is outside and what is inside. And so there are many people who do at present Vedic cosmology who talk about flat Earth, like it's literally flat, like a ground, like you can run from one end to the other in a car, and it's like a flat land basically. Right? So it goes back to the older flat Earth things which were debunked during time of Copernicus and Galileo, and then it's sort of coming back because some people are thinking that is, and then comes all these conspiracy theories about how everything has been hidden from our, etc., etc. So these are, we have to steer clear by making a distinction about this earthly vision is produced from the earth and it has a picture of the earth inside itself, but it is not the real earth. Right? So there are again three things. There is a vision. That vision includes everything that you can see cosmos. And there are certain things which are not included in this vision. Right? So it's not that from your vision we can see that. And that's one of the reasons that there are many planetary systems which are said to exist at a higher level, which are not in the earthly vision. So you cannot see them. And there are many things which cannot be seen in the earthly vision, but they exist outside. And that you understand only if you make a distinction between these two kinds of things. Now, in case somebody is feeling a little pressured here, I'll just give a quick example about how these two things also exist in Vedic astrology. And they are called Surya Siddhanta and Drik Siddhanta. Now, the Surya Siddhanta is the traditional system of understanding of the real cosmology, which talks about this real earth and real moon. Okay. Now, couple of thousand years ago, when Aryabhatta and Bhaskaracharya and all these people came, they could not, or they were not interested in talking about this real earth and real moon. They started talking about how we see the stuff from inside this earthly vision. And that's when a new sort of astronomy was created, which is different from cosmology. Right? So that people talk about Hindu astronomy. That Hindu astronomy is what is inside earthly vision, whereas Vedic cosmology is what is outside. Right? So these are completely different things. And once it came inside, then they started doing all kinds of, angles and trigonometry and equations and things like that. And people are always getting mixed up between cosmology and astronomy. So there is a Hindu astronomy, and in astrology, these two things are there. So if you pick up a horoscope calculator, for example, and you say, I want Surya Siddhanta, you will get different positions of these planets than if you do Drik Siddhanta. If you do Drik Siddhanta, you will get different positions. And these Drik essentially means seeing, what we are seeing or what is in our vision. So this earthly vision stuff will produce a chart which is completely different from what the real moon and the real earth charts are. Okay? Why I'm making this point is just to explain that these two concepts are, this is not some alien stuff. This is their life. But the thing is that everybody sort of uses this Drik Siddhanta today. So even if you're talking about astrologers today, they are not studying Vedic cosmology. They are not studying the real stuff. They are studying how we see it. Whereas Brihad Parashar Hora and all these scriptures, they are talking about what the real stuff is outside. So what is Earth in Vedic cosmology? What is Bhuloka or Bharatvarsha? And there are many terms. We'll not get into that. But basically, what is it? It's a type of experience. Remember, space is nothing but the domain of experience. Soul moves in the space to get a different kind of experience. So it has moved into a certain region of space that is called Earth, right? So it's a type of experience. And this experience includes the experience of Earth, right? It is not just, so it's earthly experience and experience of Earth. Okay, just like there's a self and there is a picture of the self, which is called the ego. So this earthly experience of Earth is a particular understanding of Earth. It's not the only understanding. There are other understandings in which, for instance, the Earth is described as a cow, and it has, every, personality is represented inside the body of a cow. And that's a different understanding of Earth. That's not this Earth, right? It's a different way of picturing the Earth. So the Earth that we are talking about, the sphere that we're talking about, is earthly vision of the Earth, whereas the cow and things like that, there are other kinds of visions of the same Earth. And this experience, of course, includes, other kinds of experiences like cars and hotels and moon, Jupiter, Saturn, and things like that. So there are certain things which are available only in the earthly experience, right? And there are certain things which are beyond earthly experience. So there's experience of stuff on the earth and this earthly experience of that stuff. They're two completely different things. Now, this idea about semantics requires a different way of thinking about reality as concepts. And this is something I was discussing in the previous talk about Sankhya, how we have to think in terms of concepts. So even like sensations, for example, color, taste, touch, smell, yellow, green, blue, or intentions or meanings, and all these things are different kinds of different types of semantics. And the fundamental problem here is that this semantic way of looking at reality does not fit into the classical logic. And by classical logic, I mean two things: mutual exclusion and non-contradiction. So I'll just explain why that doesn't fit. Now, we return to these same three things that we talked about in a very simple pictorial illustration so that you can remember and take home this. If you take one picture away, take this picture away. You can think of mammal as an idea, and then there are individual instances of mammal like dog and cat. And if you put all the dogs and cats and cows and horses, everything together, then you get a set that you can call a mammal. But each member inside this set is also a mammal because there is mammal immanent inside each individual, right? So this gives us three definitions of mammal. There is an idea, which you can call the transcendent idea, which is because it's beyond all these individual mammals. Then there is a set of all these things which you can call mammal. And then there is an immanent idea, which is inside each of these mammals. So these are called the three modes of reality, or Trigunatmika, Prakriti, and things like that, because everything is constructed using these three basic concepts of transcendence, immanence, and collection. And this is a more detailed conversation, but think about this basic problem: how can something be inside a dog, outside the dog, as well as dog plus cat plus horse plus donkey, and so on. So these are the three things, and we cannot represent these three things in a classical logical sense, because the idea is both transcendent and immanent and a collection, right? So if in modern mathematics, for example, we would say that mammal, there is nothing called idea mammal, and mammal is not immanent inside. Okay, mammal is nothing but the set of all things that we call mammals. right? So you collect all possible things into a set, and then you call that set a mammal. But there's nothing called immanence and there's nothing called transcendence. Now, if you do that set theory, we saw that it creates incompleteness because you need the mammal idea to even put something inside the set, right? So if you say that I want to construct the set of all possible mammals, okay, how do we put the dog unless we know it is a mammal? And how do we know it is a mammal unless we know what the idea mammal itself represents? So this problem arises in every, whether in set theory, in number theory, and it is a very fundamental problem about the nature of concepts, that the concepts have contradictory properties. They're transcendent, they're immanent, and they're collections. So we talked about, it's both, it violates classical logic because it's both inside and outside the dog and cat, and mammal is inside both dog and cat. So how can something be inside one thing and another thing? And how can something be inside and outside? And owing to these numerous problems, there is, all these things become extremely difficult to understand. Even if, if we were talking about the previous topics in cosmology, we could still talk about strength and power and, alternative geometry. But the bigger problem is that the thing that we discussed earlier, that inside the mind, you have touch and smell and taste and sound. Okay. And touch and taste and smell and sound is outside the mind also. Right. So you have an apple, there is a representation of an apple. The apple is inside the mind, the apple is outside. And the apple, if you talk about, your set construction, you can say all the apples together in the world constitute or define what we mean by an apple. So these things make it inconceivable of what is called achintya. But it's achintya only in terms of current logic, not inconceivable in ordinary language. So I can explain to you how the mammal is outside, how the mammal is inside, how the mammal is a set. And we have no problem because we use these three ways of using mammal all the time, right? So we can say a cat is a mammal, right? Or a dog is a mammal. But we don't say that mammal is a dog. Mammal is a cat. We don't say that. Mammal is not a dog. Mammal is not a cat. But a cat is a mammal and a dog is a mammal. So the principle of identity is broken because A is B, but B is not A. And that is pervasive across all concepts. Whenever you have two concepts, one of which is more abstract, the other one is more contingent. So you get this problem all the time. Now, just to give one final example, and then we'll probably wrap it up and try to take questions. Semantics applies to everything. It is not just about mammals and cats. You can take any two concepts. You can take your sense perception, like we explained. Your sense perception is in the mind, and the mental properties are in the sense perception. Everything exists inside and outside. And because of this inside and outside business, we get a lot of contradictions in classical logic. So here is another example. You can say physics is knowledge, chemistry is knowledge, but knowledge is not physics. Knowledge is not chemistry. And yet knowledge is all the subjects put together. So there are three definitions of knowledge. There is a transcendent concept of what we mean by knowledge. Then each subject like physics and chemistry is also knowledge. And knowledge is the set of all things. Now in modern set theory, they'll say physics is not knowledge, chemistry is not knowledge, knowledge is nothing other outside. But knowledge is not just the set of all the textbooks. So if you take Library of Congress or some big library and say, what is knowledge? It is the set of all the books. That's all knowledge is. But the problem is that that set of knowledge, that library is only finite. Tomorrow we may write 1 million more books. And those books are not in the library. So mathematics will go one step further. Let us assume that we take into account all books that have existed in past, present, future, in this world, another world, whatever. Let's conceptualize it like that. And that's how we define knowledge. But what happens if the universe dissolves? Does the concept knowledge cease to exist, right? Or if the library is burned, does the concept knowledge cease to exist? So these are fundamental problems that if you burned the Nalanda library, did the knowledge cease to exist? No. Knowledge continued to exist, but it is because knowledge is here. It is not in the books. So there is a knowledge here, but knowledge is also in the books, and knowledge is all these books. So these are three things. And due to this problem, we cannot represent knowledge in current logic. That's the fundamental problem across mathematics. It's in computer science. It appears in physics, and so on. But the basic issue is that semantics cannot be encoded in the current physics. It cannot, because it cannot be encoded in current mathematics, because it cannot be encoded in current logic. So the revision to thinking has to begin from revision about these simple diagrams like physics is knowledge, chemistry is knowledge. Knowledge is not physics or chemistry, but knowledge is all these things put together. So if we can, we have to conceive or reconceive alternative concepts of logic. And based on that conception of logic, we have to define everything again, like numbers again. Once you define numbers again, then the hierarchy of numbers, that's how you get space, that's how you get distance, that's how you get cosmology, right? But the problem is very fundamental. So this alternative concept of the nature of or the logic is what Nyaya philosophy is, right? So the Indian Nyaya philosophy or the Indian logic is essentially this. It talks about how physics emanates from knowledge, how chemistry emanates from knowledge, and how all these three things, all these things collectively are called knowledge. So this is a completely different way of understanding logic. Unfortunately, all these things are at the present lost, and people think that logic is nothing but syllogisms. And so people talk about Nyaya syllogism and Greek syllogisms and things like that. But the deeper insights about the problems that Nyaya is talking about and what modern logic is completely different. So I'm doing some work on trying to translate these original texts at this time to bring out these fundamental problems and how to think differently about logic if we have to understand these simple things. So let's recap and quickly summarize. So we talk about we talked about space in modern science is it's called the Cartesian res extensa, something that has extension. And whereas Sankhya and Vedic philosophy discuss or talk about experience as all the types of like sensations, concepts, intentions, moral values, and things like that. And this discussion about this experience constitutes an absolute space. So what is universe? Universe in Vedic philosophy is all that you can experience. Everything that is experienceable is the universe. So this everything that can be experienced is not necessarily being experienced right now, right? So the universe exists as a potentiality, which part of it will manifest over a period of time, and time is then defined as the succession of all these experiences such that you will exhaust the whole potentiality of the domain of experience over time. So when the universe comes to an end, when that potentiality is exhausted, which means everything that was potentially experienceable has been experienced, and therefore there is no more need. So this is the concept of time, which we'll not discuss right now, but that's the alternative idea. And based on these ideas and the change in the nature of space and the change about the idea of motion, we can explain ordinary observations like relativistic observations or curvature of space and time, time dilations, length contraction, things like a constant speed of light. All these things we can explain in a different way based on a different notion of space. And this is essentially the preliminary background that you need to understand everything else, because otherwise you will get bogged down into some. They'll talk about, there is a tree. Okay, there is a big tree, and people say, oh, literally it must be like, coconut tree, things like that. And so it becomes very difficult to comprehend what they're talking about unless and until this tree. So there are two books in case people are interested. This is a book called Mystic Universe. It's focused on Vedic cosmology. It talks, in the first couple of chapters, it talks about this tree nature of space and time and how that nature is based on the problems of logic and mathematics, how this inverted tree comes out. This is on the, this book came out last year. It is more focused on, it's a pure, almost a pure physics book. It doesn't invoke any alternative Vedic terminology, but it tries to explain all the observations in a different way. So these are the two books. So this is more for if you're more interested in understanding what cosmology is, the description of the model of the universe, then this is the book. If you want to know the theory on which this model is based, then the second book is there. So I'll pause here. I hope this has been useful.
So my first question is space and Akash the same thing that we are talking about? And then I'll ask the other question.
Yes, space and Akash are same with, let me explain. So Akash has many meanings. The one meaning is what, the thing, the space from which the body expands, right? So taste, that sounds, smell, and so that has a basis in what is called Akash or ether. But even the mind is also called Akash, and everything else is Akash, right? So depending on the context, the word is used, but basically Akash's property is that it comprises of meaning, or each location in space is a different meaning, right? So that's why Shabda and Akash. So Shabda means sound or like words. And so locations in space, it's like you said, location number 10, right? So that 10 is not the quantity 10. It is actually a kind of experience. And so there are big theory about numbers, but essentially Akash and space are the same thing. But because it's imbued with this modern ideas about space as a box, therefore there are many problems. So I
understand that. So
yeah.
the other question, that's the reason I wanted to clarify, because we see Akash as both ether as well as space. So when we talk of how the how the universe began, and at first there was Akash only, and then the other things developed in it. And people sometimes pray to the universe, but they're actually praying to Akash. When they say, I don't believe in God and I pray to the universe, and I'm like, what is the universe? It's like the whole expanse, the everything. So so that's what I was trying to ascertain, if we are on the same page. Okay, so the next question is, now that we know the theory of Akash and we know it is also got to do with experience, tell me, where is it written, or how to manipulate this? And by manipulation, I don't mean a negative manipulation. I have read a lot about, how sound, because sound travels in the medium of Akash.
Yes.
So sound is one way of clearing that space, whether we talk of emotional space. So, whatever we are suffering, we have mantra chanting to alleviate our suffering. And this is my question. How, you've given us great information, which is intellectual information. Now, for this intellectual information to be transformed into real knowledge, we should know how to apply this. And this is what my question is. How do I, as an individual, learn to apply the knowledge that you've just given me in order to manipulate my own experience? Because see, experience also, you clarified that it stems from Akash. So how is that I can change my future, I can change my experience, and change things? And why I'm saying this is because I have actually studied how your thoughts can influence your past, and as a result influence your present or your future. And we have so many we have so many rituals in Hinduism which actually do that, specifically the ritual of Shraddh, wherein you go and you benefit the ancestors in the past. So again, I'm just trying to explain myself here a little bit so that you understand.
I got you. I got your question. So the theory, let me just recap in 2 sentences and I'll jump into the application. So the theory is essentially the semantic space is, you can say in one sense numbers, in other sense you can say words and letters. So when we talk about mantra chanting or manipulation, we are not manipulating matter, we are manipulating ourselves to move to a different location, right? So remember that. So,
Correct. So we are only manipulating our space, because
yes,
our experience is related to our space.
yes, our location in the universal space.
Yeah.
Right. So it's you can think of like if you're sitting in a boat and you're rowing, and that rowing is not moving the ocean, but it's you are moving in that ocean, right, by rowing yourself. So mantra chanting is essentially you're rowing yourself into this. And there are different kinds of mantras. Now, what happens is that in this present age, uh, uh, mantras, but when we chant mantras like
No, don't get stuck on the mantras. I was just giving an example.
yeah, that's fine. That's fine. That's fine.
Okay.
That's fine. Mantra is a general term which, because everything is sound, everything is Sabda Brahman. My website is called Shabda, so this is not a I mean everything is that meaning, basically representation of meaning. So what happens is uh, when we speak right now, what is happening, only the tongue is speaking and the mind is really not, I mean, the mind may be thinking sometimes, but it's not deeper than that. Okay. So most of the time, for example, when like you can distinguish, for example, a powerful speech and a regular speech. So a politician comes to an election campaign and he gives some speech. By listening to that speech, immediately you know the man is just talking. Okay, he doesn't mean anything. But there are certain powerful speakers, when they speak, you can feel that they really mean it. Okay. So there are, like we talked about, there are several levels at which meaning exists. And sometimes it is just the tongue moving without any meaning. Sometimes there is some mental meaning. You can comprehend the person. Similarly, there are deeper and deeper levels of meaning. Now, mantras don't work today most of the time in terms of manipulation is because the deeper level reality is not changing. It's only the superficial reality. Okay. And that's why mantras have to be chanted over a long period of time. So there are certain mantras which you can consistently chant over a long period of time. And there are certain mantras which you have to chant once and they will produce an effect. Those things have stopped producing effect or they cannot produce effect because the point of the effect was to move myself. And I would move myself only if I impacted the deepest level of reality. But if I cannot impact the deep level of reality, I'm just uttering the sound, not actually moving myself. Right? So then there are like we say Shraddha and things like that. Yes, we are doing those rituals today. But those are not having the kind of effects that they're supposed to have. Lots of these rituals, for example, you can invite rain. There are even weapons, right? So Mahabharata talks about numerous weapons they could launch simply by chanting mantras, but we can't do that today. So what are the mantras then? Then the best mantra is you chant God's names, and God is meaning. God is also meaning, and the sound of His name is basically the embodiment of that meaning. So when you can chant that name, then you are experiencing. And by that process, what happens is over a period of time, you purify your consciousness so that you can make deep level impacts. When you can make those deep level impacts, then you could also chant the other mantras and that will produce effect. Otherwise, you can chant all these mantras, but they're not the desired effects. Did I answer your question?
No.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so what I was not interested in mantra chanting. I just gave you an example that mantra chanting is supposed to, or it changes, your experience or akash, or I was saying it is an example, like even the dong in today's days, the tong, or, we have the Tibetan bowl meditation. These are all what trying to change the space, right? They're trying to change the vibe through vibration, of course, sound. So I'm saying we've done an intellectual exercise on Akash. I want to know how to apply it to make it knowledge, because ultimately Akash has to change for us. For us to benefit from this knowledge, we should know how to apply this. So
Right.
in order to experience in order to change my Akash, or to change my experience, or to change things, how can I apply? And you don't need to give me, and I mean, you can give me whatever works. I'm not stuck on mantra, and I'm not stuck
I am giving
on
you mantra. I'm saying that in this age, there are certain mantras. So see, let's dive a little deeper into it. Okay, there are many Vedic mantras. They are like sounds like cream.
So you're saying that the mantra is the most powerful of them all?
Mantra
Because
is the best way. Mantra is the best way because it requires the least amount of rules and regulations. So even if you're doing a fire sacrifice, that requires more, rules and regulations, right? Mantras are the least rules and regulations, is the easiest way to do it. But I'm saying that if you want to change your experience, you have to chant certain mantras over a period of time, right? So
Okay.
mantra is the best way. It's not earlier also, whether in the past ages also, they have always been chanting mantras, even if they do anything else like the yogasana, pranayam, etc., whatever else they do, they always chant mantras, because mantra is, it said manatrayate iti mantra. So that, that which frees the mind is called mantra. Tanutrayate iti tantra. So what frees the body is the tantra. So mantra, you are talking about freeing the mind, you're talking about having a different experience. The point is this: to have a different experience, you have to change your location or change who you are. Right?
No, that's the point. How does one do that? Because that
How
can
does
only
one do
happen in the
that
space
is,
of Akash.
yeah, so space is nothing but it's a domain of experience, and Jivatma or the soul is moving in that space. How you move there is by mantra chanting.
What is the difference between astronomy and cosmology? I think you already explained in the lecture.
Yeah.
So if you want to take it up, it's fine. Otherwise, I can go to the next question.
Astronomy and cosmology. So cosmology is, like I said, it's the real world, and astronomy is the apparent world, right? So let me give a simple example. Let's say you see an apple, and your apple seems like red, round, sweet, red, round, these things. These are appearances. But we know that there is something that's behind this appearance. Okay. And that thing which is behind this, and it is creating this impression of red, round, and sweet, is, that called reality. So there's a difference between reality and appearance, or you can say reality and phenomena. Okay, so these distinctions are always made, and so Vedic cosmology is the reality, and Vedic astronomy is the appearance. So we explained that, discussed that there is something called Drik Siddhanta and Surya Siddhanta. Surya Siddhanta is the reality, Drik Siddhanta is the vision, and so how it appears to us. This Drik Siddhanta, or what we call astronomy, it came in very late in the history. Earlier, everybody was doing cosmology. Astronomy came in very late. And but in modern science, astronomy and cosmology are really the same thing. The difference is very subtle. Astronomy is observation, and cosmology is theory. Okay, but they both refer to the appearance. Whereas in Vedic system, the cosmology refers to the reality and astronomy to the appearance.
So this is quite powerful stuff, and I think it requires step-by-step training and understanding, because you are covering everything in this universe here. This is something related to, in modern terminology, something related to, or like grand unified theory, where you're connecting outer space with inner space, or bringing consciousness or observer into ultimate theory of reality. which is missing in modern science this day. My question is, when you say that semantic space is absolute, but we have, also this theory of relative space and absolute space, because we consider self as an absolute and whatever is not self as a relative space. So how do you define this semantic space? Is the semantic space relative or absolute, or it incorporates both? And how to differentiate between that?
Yeah, semantic space is an absolute space. By absolute, I simply mean that there is a root, there are trunks, there are branches, there are leaves. So it expands from a origin. Because the origin is fixed and the dimensions are fixed, therefore it is absolute. It's a very technical terminology, because in physics, what is absolute space? That has a fixed origin, that is a fixed, dimensions. That with something that has a fixed origin and fixed dimensions is a, absolute space. Relative space is where origin can be anything, right? Or dimensionality can be anything. So that is a relative. So semantic space is an absolute space, right? And what is relative is the person is moving in this space. So each person says, I am the origin. I will measure with me as the reference for everything else. So for example, let's say, Westerners, for example, might say that equality is the basic measure in terms of which we will measure everything. So if some society is equal, then we will say they are high. If some society is unequal, we'll say they are primitive or they are low, right? Or so in this way, everybody thinks that I am the reference in terms of which I measure. And this is true not just, cultures, but also individuals. So this thing that you're saying, the self is absolute, that is not true. In this current present situation, there are so many selves. You have one reference frame, I have another reference frame. Everybody has their own viewpoint by which they are judging the world. Right? So that is relativity. And but in this relative space also, we can understand that even though I have a certain viewpoint, that viewpoint is not the perfect viewpoint. There is an absolute viewpoint, right? Just like I can say that I am at point number 10, but there is a point number 0. So in that case, even though I am at 10, but if I just understand 0, then I have grasped the nature of, the absolute space without actually going to 0. There are two different things. One is, if I went to 0 and then I said that I am still the origin of everything, in that case, I would have, consider myself as the origin and resolve the problem of relative space. But I can still be where I am and still consider or recognize that there is an origin. And that way, I have understood the absolute space.
But here, this absolute space is considered in our scriptures as a non-dual space, where nothing, no other exists. Okay, no one else is there. So when you say that semantic space is there, you include mind, intention, morality, and all these come into semantic spaces. When you're saying it has its origin at the 0 space rather than 10 number or 0 number, so you are saying that self is 0 number and non-dual space from which all these things originating, and semantic space is coming?
Right. So you are talking about, okay, this is a very big discussion, Ram. So let me try to capture what is non-duality in a very quick sense, there are two broad meanings of non-duality. Okay. First non-duality meaning says, which comes from Advaita philosophy. It says that there are, you and I are not different. This computer and me are not different. This tree and, these are not different. This is one. So non-two-ness is called non-duality. There is another semantic meaning or another sophisticated meaning of non-duality, which says that in this world, every choice is made between two bad alternatives. Like I give an example sometimes. If you buy a car which is cheap, okay, it will not have many features. Like it might not have an air conditioner, it might not have moving roof, all these fancy features. So if the car is cheap, then it has not many features. But if you have all the features, then it is also very expensive. So duality means there is always a contradiction between cost and features. It's just one example. There are many such principles of dualism, which means there is always a trade-off. If you want a feature-rich car, then it has to be very expensive. If you want a cheap car, then it has to be losing in features. But the fact is, everybody wants a fully featured car that is free, right? Who doesn't, tell me, who doesn't want a car which is free and it has everything in it? Everybody wants that, right? But in this world, you cannot get it. In this world, you cannot get something that is, it has all the features and it is completely free. That is duality. Because there are two opposite things you want. You don't want to give up anything, but you are forced to give up one thing to get the other thing. That's the other meaning of duality. Okay. And from this duality, you can even construct the other duality of two-ness, which means I have made some compromises and you have made some compromises. Okay. Everybody has made a different set of compromises, and that is why we are all different. Okay. My compromises are different from your compromises. But so this, from the semantic notion of non-two-ness, you can construct the physical notion of non-two-ness or non-duality. Okay. But once you get this other notion of, then you can also talk about a non-duality in which we can all be separate but not compromising. So you can have a car which is free and fully featured. I can have a car in which is free and fully featured. You can drive a car, I can drive my car, and there is non-duality for me, there is non-duality for you. Okay. So this is a deeper discussion about what non-duality is, and it's a very big discussion. I have a book on this thing called The Science of God, which discusses 12 principles of perfection. So what is perfection is essentially, it is free and it has all the features. Okay. It is, it's the smallest and it's the largest. It has all the functionality and it has no price for me to pay. So there are 12 such principles, and the trade-off between these principles is what creates the dualism of this world, because everybody and everything is making some or the other compromise, and we are different because we are incomplete in different ways, right? So everything is incomplete because it has made some compromise, but there is a way in which without merging everything, the compromise can be resolved. So that is a deeper understanding of Vedanta. I understand what you are talking about, and what happens is, if you adopt that Advaita point of view that you are talking about, what essentially will happen is you will not be able to explain anything else, because the whole thing becomes an illusion, right? The material world becomes an illusion. The question becomes how this illusion arises. Am I the creator of this illusion? That means I must be the cause, and the world must exist inside me for me to create this world, right? So if you say, Ram, for example, that I have created this world, then I can ask you, man, then why are you suffering in your own creation? Right? Just like a spider can create a web and then say, oh, I am caught in the web. But why would the spider not be intelligent enough to create a web in which it can enjoy? So that there are many such issues, and unfortunately that's a different discussion. It will take us into more theology than cosmology.
Ashish, in your talk, you were talking about the different levels of reality, the different realities, and the different visions and perceptions.
Yeah.
That often brings us to the question of this much of, I mean, this talked about question that perception is real, but it's not reality, because perception is different
Yes.
for everybody and that. So when you're talking about that real thing, which is different from what we see as the real thing,
Yes.
are you talking about are you making a distinction between the relative reality and the absolute reality? Is that what you are trying to say?
No, I'm not making that distinction. I'm just saying that what you see, okay, is different from. So first of all, you don't see everything. That's the first point, right? Even if you're looking at me, you cannot understand what I'm feeling, right? Or what I'm thinking. So we are not seeing all the deeper levels of reality, right? And also that whatever we are seeing is, it has some similarity to the reality, but it is not exactly that reality. And if you understand physics, then it becomes very easy, because in physics, every particle is the only four properties, which is momentum, energy, angular momentum, and spin. These four properties, so there is a difference between reality and perception. Okay, that has got nothing. Relativity is to say that I am the center of the world. Everybody is thinking that they are the center of the world. I will judge everything from my point of view. That is relativity, right? If you say that I think this is wrong and I think this is right, if everybody has their own opinion about reality, that is relativity. But if we all agree on if everybody agrees on the nature of reality, then there can be an absolute truth which is understood by many relative persons. It is not relative anymore, because we have all accepted the same absolute truth, right?
Okay, so it's not the absolute truth in the sense of the spiritual, the ultimate truth, but
It can be absolute. It can be absolute. This spiritual material, there's not such a stark difference. That's another big discussion. But so if you pick up a book and read, then you'll see some of these things, that these distinctions are not so hard and fast. This matter is actually described in Sankhya philosophy as, even in Bhagavad Gita, as a divine energy. Daivi hiye sagunamayi maya durataya. So Krishna says this is Daivi. Even though it is Gudamayi, it is Daivi. It is divine. It is not this Achit or unconscious and all these things. These words are not used. Never across any place you will find these things. It's dull, it's inert. No. It is Daivi. Okay, so this material and spiritual, there is a subtle difference. And that difference is simply that there is a world in which you can get cars that are free and have full features. And in a world, there is another world in which you can get a car where you have to pay the more feature you want, the more price you have to pay. Okay, that's the only difference. That's the only difference. So there is a world of duality and there is a world of non-duality. People say that in the non-dual world there are no cars. Okay. Now that world is much worse than if you had a car which had all the features and it was free. Is it not? So if somebody's conception of perfection is that to avoid paying any price for the car, I must just dissolve all the cars and trucks and I should just give up everything. That world is not as perfect than the world where everything is free and it is fully featured. Okay. So there are many conceptions of Advaita. It's not only one conception. One conception says, if you do not buy the car, you have to pay no price. Okay, then we understand that. In this world also we can get that type of Advaita. I'll not buy a car. I'll not eat food. I'll not wear clothes. I'll not have a body. We can understand that if you don't take anything, you have to pay no price. That's something easily understandable. More difficult to understand is we will take everything and yet we have to pay no price.
True,
Yeah.
true. Yeah. I think Arjun wants to ask a question.
Yeah.
So as I understand it, please correct me if I'm wrong. The semantic space you are talking about is, it can be, better understood in terms of what we call in our terminology as loka. For example, when we talk about loka, and people have, this conception of 14 lokas or all different lokas, they generally they should not be seen in spatial sense, that they are सबसे ऊपर एक लोक है, फिर दूसरा तीसरा इस तरह का.
No, that their levels are there.
Yeah.
No, those levels are there. That I have explained. That
Yeah.
I have explained. Even like Krishna says, Indriyani parani ahur indriyabhya param manaha manasastu para buddhi buddhe parasastu saha.
Yes.
So the senses are higher than the body. The mind is higher than the senses. The intellect is higher than the mind, and the soul is higher than the intellect. So somebody asked me, I explained this concept, it's higher. So I say, what is the height?
Yes.
So
the
the
levels,
point is, it is higher, but it is not height in the sense that you can
Yes.
use a ruler to measure this height.
yes,
It
yes,
is not that physical height.
Yes.
It's like you can say, this person is higher. Oh, he is higher boss. Okay? The
yes,
higher boss can work on the lower floor of the building.
yes, yes.
Okay, he is not higher in the physical sense, he is higher in a completely semantic, in a different sense. So these lokas are higher. Okay, it is but semantics is not just that, it is this basic, like I explained, to understand space itself, you have to understand the nature of mind. Space is like a mind, not like the space that you are seeing.
Yes, yes,
And the difference is that inside the space there is a representation of that space.
yes. So as I understand it is that, for example, we have Manushya Loka, and for example, how we perceive the reality, the humans, and then
Yes.
we have the the animals or the Pashu Loka. So we can say that how they perceive the reality, it can be called Pashu Loka. But they are not in the sense of different, in the sense of distance, physical distance. They can exist.
Yeah, but there is no such thing as Pashu Loka.
Yeah, I was just giving.
Yeah. Yes,
how
I understand.
Reality,
Yes.
it can be called Manushya Loka, and how someone else perceives that reality, it can be his or their Loka.
Yes. So there are different perceptions of reality, but there are also different realities. Okay, it is not simply perception. Like I explained, cars are there in our, planet, okay, or in our place. So there is an earthly way of looking at car, and there is car itself. In other planets, cars are not there because they can fly with their mental abilities. They don't need a car. Okay, so there is something called earthly objects, and there is earthly vision of the earthly object. These are two different things. I explained 3 times, I think. There is earth and there is earthly vision of earth.